All right, it is the top of the hour, so we are going to go ahead and get started with today's webinar, E-Discovery Made Easy. We appreciate you joining us today, and the first thing I'd like to do is just take a second and introduce our speakers today. My name is Shana Horka, and I work in product marketing here at Gimmal. I'm joined by our key speakers today, Gimmal's President and Chief Strategy Officer, Chris Caplinger, and Gimmal Product Manager, Rick Wilson. Now, before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping items to go through. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to submit them in the Q&A section on your screen, and we're going to answer as many as we have time for at the end of the presentation. There will be at least one poll question that you will see pop up, so please keep an eye out for that. And as always, if you have any technical difficulties, please let us know so we can assist you. To kick things off, I have just a few slides here to tell you a little bit about Gimmal and how we can help you take control of your information with our suite of solutions. Gimmal is an information governance company founded in 2002. Our mission is to help you achieve your information governance goals by providing solutions that help you balance the value your information provides with the risk it also presents. Whether you're trying to discover information in unstructured data sources, migrate from legacy systems, or comply with policies across multiple repositories, Gimmal can help you achieve your information governance goals. We have a client success team and global network of partners that deliver solutions in conjunction with key partners like Microsoft and SAP. Gimmal's family of software products work together to let you create an efficient digital workplace. Our comprehensive solution includes migration, file analysis, electronic and physical records management, document management for SAP. And for those that are not new to our webinars, you might have noticed a slight name change in the past couple months. They are the same products, but with just a more convenient name. We're also very excited about one of our most recent items in the news of our acquisition of Sherpa Software earlier this month, adding e-discovery and data governance capabilities to our Gimmal Discover product, which we will be going through today. But without further ado, I will hand it over to Chris so he can get started with today's presentation.
Great, thank you, Shana, and I appreciate everyone attending today. So there are many challenges around the need to produce information, whether it's legal, regulative, or internally driven. Existing or potential lawsuits and audits drive a need to produce content and deliver to third parties for review. The problem is, as many of you probably already know, external legal review is very expensive, and organizations typically send too much information because they don't have the technology to narrow down the collection to only the relevant content that they need. Collection also puts a burden on IT and others responsible for collecting the data because they often have to search each individual system. On top of this, e-discovery is not just something that needs to happen for legal matters, but if you're a government organization, in the federal, state, or local, you're going to have to deal with these collections. And it's the same problem. They're also going to struggle due to the lack of visibility. Other things that happen are privacy laws, really driving e-discovery a lot now. While this started in the EU, European Union, with GDPR, California has CCPA, and other states have followed with their own laws. I think maybe the latest is Virginia, with it just in the last few weeks have created a new privacy law as well. All right, next slide, Shana. So at Gimmal, we believe that the electronic discovery reference model, also known to many of you as EDRM, is a great way to look at e-discovery and to start to tackle the problem. If you start on the left-hand side with information governance, identifying information for preservation and collection becomes much less burdensome because you already have known where most relevant content is stored. In addition, Shana was talking just a few minutes ago about balancing the value of risk, balancing the value versus risk of information. And this is where it becomes relevant. If you consistently remove data that no longer needs to be kept, it can greatly simplify this process. The less information you have to search, collect, and review, the less expensive e-discovery will be. Okay, Shana, next slide. So this all said, it brings us to a few key tips for effective discovery. First, be proactive. This is why the left side of the EDRM model is important. Having good policies and processes to already know what you will have will ease the burden of producing this information. The second, ensure it's defensible. I've been involved with record management for quite a while now, probably actually most of my life or most of my adult life. And the one key to success is being able to prove you did what you said you were going to do. It is much better to be consistent with an imperfect processes than it is failing to follow something that's perfect. Third is collaborate. Like any process, it's only going to be as good as the people that are involved. You need to find the pain points, you need to define the scope, and ensure everyone is trained. Be sure everyone involved knows what the plan is and is part of putting together that plan. All right, Shana, next slide. And I'm going to drop off and I'm going to turn it over to Rick, and he's going to talk more about the implementation of eDiscovery.
Hey,
Rick,
Chris, thanks. Thanks so much for the little background on eDiscovery there. I'm sure it's helpful for many on the call who may be new to the topic, right? So this is something that we know a lot of records people are kind of being introduced to, and we wanted to be sure you understand how the process works, but not only that, how we may be able to help you with that. So let me dive into some statistics. We talked a little bit about, or Chris talked a little bit about the fact that privacy's really become a driving component behind the increased volume of eDiscovery. Traditionally, of course, this has been litigation. So eDiscovery was the bailiwick of the lawyers. They took care of all that. And our involvement as IT or records people or peripheral people outside of the litigation arm of the organization was maybe just helping to round up some information, but we see that changing. We see it changing dramatically, which also ties into the fact that this is becoming more collaborative. A lot of that's being driven by these privacy regulations that Chris referenced. We also see regulatory scrutiny in a lot of different areas expanding over the next several years. These are statistics from an Extero survey that you're looking at. So there's really a lot of information to prove that eDiscovery is becoming a more relevant business process that you need to deal with. A key to that, though, is if you look at the top of the slide, we need to be able to reach content in a variety of areas. So from a product point of view at Gimmal, we developed Gimmal Discover to empower you to be able to do that. You can see on this slide the variety of unstructured content that we currently support. These are all areas that you may be asked to provide information from in the context of your eDiscovery. And we're adding more. So we're currently working on 2 additions to this model. These are all currently available and will soon have support for a few more content areas that have been asked for by a number of our clients. I did want to call out one area in particular on this slide, kind of in the upper left. Local files on laptops and workstations have been notoriously difficult to include in eDiscovery and often extremely labor intensive. So traditionally, the way that worked is if you had to search information on one of your executives' laptops, you either had to go confiscate that device so you had access to the information, or perhaps if they were in a different city and had the right kind of laptop configuration, they could take their laptop hard drive out and mail it to you so that you had it to perform the eDiscovery search on. Or maybe you had to dispatch one of your IT folks to go gather that information and image that laptop. Any of those alternatives were expensive and very labor intensive. With Gimmal Discover, we've provided a way to install an agent on those devices so that you have access to that content. That helps you in a couple of ways. Not only can you perform that eDiscovery search remotely, so you can access the information that might be stored on local files in that machine, or maybe even PST content if you still use those in your environment. But beyond that, you can search that information for governance purposes. So we're focusing, of course, on eDiscovery as our topic for today, but Gimmal Discover also provides a suite of information governance capabilities that's going to allow you to search for specific content based on criteria that you define, and then take action on that content, which could be as simple as perhaps reporting on it. Hey, do I have sensitive data or client confidential information in any of these repositories? Or maybe you want to be a little bit more proactive and copy, move, delete that information. So all of that is available to you. I wanted to share just a couple of product slides. Sometimes in this sort of a scenario, picture's worth 1,000 words, right? So I wanted to show you a little bit about some of the things Gimmal Discover can do from a platform point of view for you. This is an actual screenshot from the software that you're looking at. And what we're looking at today is the ability to interact with Microsoft 365. So if you happen to be a Microsoft 365 customer, which many organizations are today, and it seems to be on the growth curve, certainly, we integrate with that platform to allow you to set legal hold. Now, this would be the ability to preserve content, or if you will, lock it in place right inside the Microsoft 365 platform. So you don't have to leave your Gimmal Discover environment and log in to an administrative session in Microsoft 365 to trigger that preservation hold. You can do it right from this screen by selecting a mailbox. You can see in my mailbox list here a little blue mailbox check beside a specific box, and then checking the option to enable legal hold on the server. That will send the proper information to Microsoft 365 that says this mailbox needs to have its content preserved. So one other view of very similar functionality, this is sort of the other side of that coin, if you will. Oftentimes, when a litigation occurs, or maybe even in a regulatory scenario, you do need to preserve content so it's not being removed or deleted. But you also need to communicate with your employees. Oftentimes you'll hear the legal team refer to them as custodians, the people who own that information. And that communication takes a couple of forms. So one of the things that needs to be done is you need to inform that custodian officially that they're on litigation hold. This is something a judge could ask for. So it's important that you have the ability to be able to prove that you've made that request. Right in Gimmal Discover, we provide the ability for you to format those litigation hold notices to send to your custodians. That transmission is done through email. So your custodian receives an email with some content about the litigation hold that you specify. You can see that kind of down at the bottom of the preview pane here. In addition to that, there's a link in that email that your custodian would click to signify they've acknowledged or received that communication. Another important point. So now when you go in front of a judge who says, can you prove to me that your custodians were advised they were on litigation hold and knew they weren't supposed to be deleting content? You can show them the date the notice was sent. You can show them the date it was acknowledged. You can show them reminders that perhaps went out periodically during the course of that hold. Sometimes these cases go on for weeks or months, and maybe you want to remind that custodian periodically. All that can be tracked from within Gimmal Discover for you. In addition, you can survey them to gather some additional information. So did you have paper files relevant to this case? Did you have meetings between these dates? So you can build a survey and attach it to this hold notification and send it out as part of your process. So we've got you covered from both sides, from the standpoint of preserving your information so that it can't be maliciously deleted, and proving that you took the steps to notify your custodians and track that effectively. So let's move on and talk a little bit about collaboration. Chris touched on this a little bit, but let's call it out a little bit more. The most expensive part of the process has been traditionally reviewing information. That's because oftentimes the information was gathered up by somebody inside your organization, perhaps somebody in IT, because they had all the access rights to the content, but they didn't have the knowledge to be able to determine what responsive information was really relevant to that particular investigation. So they gathered it all up, they put it on a removable hard drive or maybe an FTP site, something like that. And then they called up outside counsel and said, okay, I've got your search results ready to parse through. And outside counsel took care of evaluating that content. That worked from a functional point of view, but as Chris mentioned before, it was an extremely expensive approach because Some of those review professionals are charging hundreds of dollars an hour. So if you can perform that level of effort inside the organization, it's going to help save you money as you go through the e-discovery process. Beyond that, though, especially with privacy and some of the other things we discussed, we see this whole process becoming more collaborative from the standpoint of having more parties involved. So what I run into frequently from our client base is IT might be the people who are charged with configuring the search because, as I said before, they have all of the proper information to allow access to the email or SharePoint or OneDrive or Box or whatever those content areas are. So those guys are the ones that are charged with providing access and making sure that you have the ability to reach content in those repositories. Then perhaps you have a paralegal maybe in your organization or somebody else who can actually build the search. And those folks typically understand the syntax that's required to perform the search. So oftentimes there's a combination of keywords, expressions, phrases, patterns, maybe even something as complex as a regular expression that needs to be part of the search criteria that's being applied to this content. And the people in your legal team would have the ability to be able to interpret that and put it in the proper format to build the search and execute it. And then beyond that, they may have the ability to start the preliminary review of those results, or perhaps you want to share that with outside counsel. I mean, that's always an option. Either way you look at that, we can provide functionality inside Gimmal to Discover to allow you to do that. So what I flipped over to here was an example of search results that were performed from an e-discovery search. And you can see this result set was fairly modest, about 1,200 results in the upper right-hand corner there. 1194 was the reach or the number of items that were returned. You can see the keyword hit highlighting in yellow on the right-hand side of the grid. But what I've highlighted on the side is the ability to select some of those results and assign a reviewer. So Gimmal Discover's multi-user. Many people in your organization might have access to the tool. And that might include the IT team, as we discussed earlier, paralegals, maybe even outside counsel. So using this facility, you can assign which of these results are going to be reviewed by which party. Becomes really important if you have thousands or sometimes tens of thousands of results that need to be parsed through, and you don't want to be duplicating effort. In addition to that, as you create the searches, you link them to a matter so you can establish a degree of privacy around who's allowed to access this content and what they're allowed to do with it. So maybe kind of sum up some of the things that we talked about today. It's important to be a little bit proactive and anticipate e-discovery. So when we think about that particular part of the equation, what we're addressing is, do we have tools in place to be able to reach the content that we might need to perform e-discovery on today? Do we have a team assembled, or do we know who the parties would be that are going to be responsible for performing that e-discovery search? And beyond that, do we have a process that's established? Chris mentioned the fact that it's extremely important to have a repeatable, documented process. Remember, especially in litigation, you're legally liable as an organization for these results. So you need to have some of that prepared in ahead of time. One other anticipation step that you may want to think about is the fact to head off some of this litigation before it even occurs. And that could be the governance part of the equation. If you recall, when we looked at that EDRM model, the ability to identify content ahead of time and maybe dispose of it before the request even comes in. Item number 2, plan for multiple sources. So we talked about the fact that oftentimes email is the primary vehicle for the investigation, for the e-discovery investigation, but that's not always the case. And we see it becoming more common that we're asking for information outside of that environment. Many of our corporate clients are migrating from internal file shares to OneDrive. So how are you going to handle that request if it comes in and you need to search content in OneDrive? How are we going to be able to access that information from workstations, as we talked about earlier? And then number 3, of course, invest in tools that provide that visibility for you. So that's not only the ability to see visibility from the results of your search, perform and view the search results, but it also might be identifying that information ahead of time so you understand where your sensitive data resides, where your client confidential information is currently resident, so you can plan for it accordingly.
Yeah, and I'll go ahead and pop back in. This is just a poll question. Rick shared a kind of a bite-sized capabilities for Gimmal Discover. We went over a couple of best practices. If you'd like to see an actual demonstration of Gimmal Discover, you'll see a poll question pop up on your screen. Yes or no, totally anonymous, and we'll have one of our reps reach out so you can see a little bit more of a deep dive. But as this is going, I'm just going to go ahead and pop into Q&A. I'd like to remind everybody, feel free to submit your questions in the little Q&A tab on the bottom of your screen if you have any. So Rick, the first question we have here is, how are you able to reach local workstations and what kind of content can you access?
Yeah, sure, Shana. So that comes up often because people aren't quite sure what the mechanism is to be able to do that. So Gimmal Discover has an agent component that you can push to those local devices. Many of our clients use something like Microsoft System Center, some kind of systems management tool, to have those agents deployed and installed. In fact, our largest deployment today is doing that to a universe of about 120,000 workstations. So they have these agents installed, and it allows them to monitor information on those devices. From a content reach standpoint on the workstations, we're typically looking at file-based information. So what are they storing in their My Documents folder, Word docs, PDFs, those sorts of things, in combination with potentially PSTs. So if your organization still allows PSTs, you haven't locked those down, we historically find a lot of old content in PSTs that might be, as they say, smoking gun type content you need to be aware of.
Great. And the next one we have is, are you looking into searching records in DocuSign?
DocuSign is an interesting question. I don't believe that we have anything in our roadmap for DocuSign at the moment. I know we're looking at Microsoft Teams as an agent. We're looking at Mac workstations. Actually, both of those are in active development, but we'll put DocuSign on the list as a potential future content area.
Great. And the next one is, eDiscover seems to be a powerful tool for indexing valuable information. Can it be customized to index medical records for healthcare industry where we operate?
Yeah, great question. So a couple of clarifications. One thing, we don't by default index content. We search it in place where it resides. We do have the option to index information on file shares if that's important to you. So that's kind of just a little architecture note, if you will. We provide inside of both the modules in Gimmal Discover, the governance component and the eDiscovery component, the ability for you to format the queries, or maybe I should say describe the criteria for the content that you're interested in. So we've had people in the past who are searching for things like medical record numbers, diagnosis codes, so ICD diagnosis codes 9 or 10. Both of those have occurred, and in fact, one of my clients that uses Gimmal Discover today is heavily involved with COVID litigation. They were one of the first medical care facilities in the US to start to see COVID cases, and as a result of that, there was a lot of litigation, and they're using Gimmal Discover to help work through those both information requests and litigation challenges as an outcome of that.
Great. And then Chris, did you have a comment on the DocuSign question?
I did, and I'll go out there. And if we want to do a follow-up, either another question on here to answer it, or follow up with a phone call later, I would be curious on the DocuSign is, rather than searching DocuSign itself as a mechanism that would move the DocuSign, typically there are contracts and agreements and things are getting signed, mechanism that moves them into a different repository, such as SharePoint or somewhere else, that are, Box or wherever you might be, storing electronic content. Because typically that's what we try to do. Instead of getting too many disparate sources, we try to move it into one of your, existing repositories if possible. But, that might not be feasible either. So just be curious if, that might be a different or better approach.
Great, thank you. It looks like that wraps up the Q&A. So if you want to just go to the next slide, if anyone can think of any other questions, our email addresses are right up there on the next slide. Feel free to email either one of us. Or if it's more convenient for you, you can just remember, info@gimmal.com. That will get back to one of us eventually. For those interested in a recording of this webinar, we will be sending it out between 24 and 48 hours in the form of a thank you email. You will also be able to view it on our website, www.gimmal.com. Let's see here. We hope to see you at our next webinar next week around space management and physical records management. But thank you everybody for coming out, and have a great rest of your day.